I asked a friend if he knew anyone who had access to some tools I needed to finish a project. "Sure," he says. "I know a guy from work that'd be happy to help you. He's actually interested in the same kind of artwork that you are." Then he warned me. "But just so you know, this guy's a little weird." Fast forward a few days, and I'm driving my friend to work, where he introduces me to his coworker. The guy seems really distant and withdrawn. We shake hands and chit-chat for a little while. He seems really interested in the woodwork I was doing, and we talked about sculptures, and about the things we'd learned and the tools we used. The guy seems to warm up a bit, and I ask him, "Would it be all right if I checked out some of your work?" He seems hesitant, but he agrees, and tells me to swing by that night. But later that day I get a call. It's the guy, and he sounds a little shaken up. He says, "Things are a little chaotic at home. Right now isn't a good time." He tells me he'll call me sometime, and I say that's fine. 2 weeks go by, and the guy calls me one afternoon. He says things have settled down, and he wants me to bring over some of my work so we can compare. So I start to head over. I notice he lives in the middle of nowhere. I had to call him up just to find his house. It's at the end of a long driveway, sitting on a huge piece of land. It's a beautiful house. The driveway itself is crowded with trees, and something about them seems weird at first. Then I realize what it is. They all have faces carved into them, and the faces are pointed at the driveway and at the house. I was very impressed by the amount of detail, but the faces were unsettling. They were twisted and full of pain, like they were crying. At first, I didn't think too much about it, because I make morbid stuff myself. But when I got out of the car, I looked back, and I couldn't help but feel creeped out. It was like the woods were watching you, wherever you were. I knock on the door, and the guy answers with a beer in his hand, looking much friendlier than before. He helps me carry in some of my stuff, and then he shows me around. The guy actually seems pretty cool. I begin to notice each room has one of those same crying faces carved onto a piece of wood, hanging above the doorframe. Up close, I could see they were more detailed than I had thought, very realistic. I asked, "What's the deal with the faces?" But he kind of tensed up and dodged my question. He led me into his workshop. He seemed to have other interests besides the creepy faces he made. There were sculptures of women, men, animals, all of them very well done and life-sized. In the back, one sculpture had a tarp over it. It was sitting right in front of a door that I guess led into another room. "That one's not quite done yet," he told me. So we began working on stuff together, just trading stories. We told each other about the times we'd injured ourselves while working, that sort of stuff. But suddenly, he changed the subject and asked me what I thought about God. "I'm not very religious," I said, "but I don't rule anything out." He starts getting a bit loud, saying that he believes God is a lie because he'd been told so. Told so? By who? I ask. He gets kind of quiet for a moment, and then he asks if I believe in spirits. I give him the same answer as before. "I don't know, it's possible." His eyes dart around the room. Then he very quietly says, "I see things in the woods, at dusk. I can see their shadows. Sometimes they whisper from the trees, and I can hear them." Okay, this is getting weird. The guy is obviously mentally disturbed, but I ask, "What do they tell you?" He says, "They tell me that God is a lie, that the only thing after death is darkness." Then he says that they laugh at him and leave him dead animals at his tree line. For a while, they visited him at night. Each face he'd carved represented a different spirit that had visited him. They can't stand to look at themselves, so they don't step within the tree line, he says. I'm pretty silent by this point. I hadn't gotten goosebumps so bad since I was a kid. I've got chills running up my spine. But he kept going. I can hear them talking in the tree line at night. They try to get me to leave the house. I try to change the subject, but he just keeps talking. He's looking down, pale as a sheet, obviously terrified. When he lifts his eyes, I can see they're welling up with tears. He says that I'm the only person he's ever told, and then he starts to apologize, saying he's scared and he doesn't know what to do anymore. Why are you so afraid? I ask. And he says, because the faces don't work anymore. He says 2 weeks ago, he had something terrible come into his living room. What do you mean? I ask. He walks over to the sculpture, the one covered in a tarp, and he pulls the tarp off. Underneath is the most mangled, ugly thing I've ever seen. It was almost human looking, but very distorted. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The loud bang came from my right, but the guy didn't even flinch. And then, again. It just continued, like a shower of hail hitting a tin roof. The guy screams, "Stop it!" And immediately it does. After that, I grab my things, and I tell the guy I'm sorry, that I need to leave. I got out of there as quickly as possible. As I'm driving off, I look into the rearview mirror. The crowd of trees looks much darker than before. About a week later, the guy calls me up and apologizes. He says, "Everything is okay now." My friend told me the guy quit shortly after that, and nobody has heard from him since.